Hello, fellow humans, and welcome to Beyond Words, the podcast where we explore the science and experience of language, music, and the mind. I'm your host, Garrett Oyama, a speech-language pathologist, a musician, and a PhD student researcher. And in each episode, we'll dive into conversations with world-class researchers, clinicians, and thinkers to uncover how communication really works. From brain and behavior to sound and meaning, we go beyond the traditional boundaries to better understand what it means to connect, express, and be human through this amazing capacity of language. All right. Hey, everybody. How's it going? I am super excited to be here today. Good to see a lot of familiar names. And I am just going to start. And Dr. Zettersten, you can feel free to turn your camera on as well. Welcome to Beyond Words. Hello. I'm your host, Garrett Oyama. I'm a musician, a practicing SLP, and a PhD student with an interest in all things language, music, and cognition. And I'm so excited that we have Dr. Martin Zettersten with us today. Dr. Zettersten is an assistant professor in the Department of Cognitive Science at the University of California, San Diego, my alma mater. Shout out CCSD, where he runs the Language and Infant Learning Lab. Before UCSD, he was a postdoctoral researcher at Princeton in the Princeton Baby Lab, and he earned his PhD in psychology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, working with Jenny Safran, who's also on the show, and Gary Lupien. His research examines how infants and children learn language and what they do with it. And he also contributes to large-scale collaborative team science projects in infant development, including Peak Bank and Many Babies, which we got some swag for right now. Before we get started, just a couple items to mention. Most of these upcoming podcasts, including today's, will include an accompanying course on speech therapy PD that is available for 0.1 ASHA CEUs. And just some disclosures, we each get compensation from speech therapy PD, but there are no other relevant non-financial disclosures to report. So without further ado, Dr. Zettersten, welcome to Beyond Words. How are you doing?
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for having me. Fun to be here.
Yeah, super honored to have you here. I always like to ask the guests just about their origin story, because it's been so interesting hearing how people get into this very particular field of, studying language and development in the brain, all things like that. So yeah, what's your origin story?
Origin story. Well, I think like a lot of people who get into cognitive science, I had no idea that it existed when I first started university in Germany. I was studying math and linguistics. I always knew I was interested in language, so that's what I was studying at the time. And then I think the right place to start the origin story is that I did a year abroad in Edinburgh in Scotland, and I had a lot of freedom in what courses to select. So I did two things. I thought, psychology, that might be relevant or useful at some point for thinking about language. So I took my first ever psychology course, and at the same time, the linguistics department turned out in Edinburgh. I was kind of the hub for studying language evolution. So Jim Herford was there, Simon Kirby was there. Kenny Smith wasn't there at the time, but eventually came back, but he'd been a PhD student there. So a lot of just big names in the field of language evolution, which was kind of a evolving, growing field at the time. And that stuff was just the coolest stuff in the world, it seemed like to me. There was just, there was so much, it was like a mishmash between stuff from linguistics, but then stuff from biology, anthropology, ecology, neuroscience, some philosophy. So it just felt so intellectually exciting to be in those courses. And then I was taking psychology at the same time. That's how I first encountered cognitive development as a field, or developmental science in general. And so that all blended together. And then I came back to Germany just knowing that, okay, I got to do more of this, especially the language development side of things. And so I got involved in research labs when I came back to Germany, and then the rest is kind of history. Yeah.
Cool. When you say language evolution, are you talking about like kind of an evolutionary perspective on language?
Yeah, like where did language come from?
Where did language come from? Okay.
First, how did we as humans first develop language? how did that happen? Why did that happen? Um, all those kinds
What's
of deep, probably unanswerable questions.
Yeah, I love those are my favorite. And that's what this podcast is really all about, exploring the things that probably have no answers. But trying to be somewhat practical about it. I don't know how it's a bit of a tension, but yeah. Um, well, that's amazing. I want to hear a little more about that maybe later. But the topic of the podcast is kind of tilted towards this idea of infants being active and curious and learning words. And AI is something that's booming right now. And I think it seems to me that a lot of people are kind of implicitly starting to frame infant learning as this kind of like AI training, sort of like machine learning, extending the machine learning analogy to developmental learning. What do you think about this framing?
Oh, that's so interesting. Okay, so I'm creating a new course right now, or I'm teaching a new course for the first time. Um, that is Well, it was once called Babies and Robots, but now I call it Growing Minds. But it basically is about, trying to take ideas from cognitive development and think about if they're relevant, in what ways they're relevant for machine learning and AI, and in what sense maybe, what AI can maybe learn from cognitive development and sort of vice versa. How like an engineering approach is maybe useful or interesting, informative for thinking about questions in cognitive development. Um, so I guess I've been thinking about it more as I've been trying to develop this course and think about it. I think there's definitely lots of useful analogies, um, and then places where the analogy probably breaks down. Um, uh, I guess, and it's useful to ground it, I suppose, in specific models. Um, when we say AI now, I suppose we're mostly thinking about large language models for the most part. So maybe that's a useful place to start. And I guess I see some useful analogies. So I think there's some interesting lessons from LLMs for thinking about development for sure. I think uh, since I was a grad student, really, I was kind of taken with this idea that prediction could be of this really important mechanism for learning in general. This also goes
Mm.
back to all this uh, 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 original work from the kind of connectionist era of computational modeling. A lot of it
Bates and
happened
Elman.
here at UCSD, right?
Yeah,
Um, Dave
Jeffrey
Rumelhart and
Elman,
Gary
right?
McClelland and Jeff Elman, and a lot of those folks were really formative in some of those like core mechanisms that still drive to some extent the models that we work with today. But one of them is prediction, right? This idea that and this goes back to Jeff Elman and recurrent neural networks. This idea that just the act of trying to predict the next word in a sequence as you're processing language, and updating your predictions as you go, kind of incorporating feedback as you make prediction errors. That basic mechanism is still one that I think about a lot, and I think is probably like some version of that is probably going on in our brains, and probably is really important for how babies are learning and kids are learning language, but also like all kinds of stuff about the world. So there's something about that core mechanism that I think is important and relevant for human development as well. Um, there's other places though where I think AI models are very different than, of course, than how and learning very differently than how infants and kids are learning. And I guess given the topic of the podcast, I'll just say two places where you could ground that, right, is in uh, uh, the way that infants and kids, even from a young age, explore the world and kind of go out and seek information about what's happening in their environment.
Yeah.
It's not really something that LLMs can do, right? They're kind of being fed this massive amount of training data. Um, Babies are much more active in their pursuit of, information about the world. So I've been thinking a lot about the ways in which that might be an important part of learning. And then I guess the other main thing to kind of talk about, I suppose, is I mean, there's lots of things to talk about, but you know, the particular multimodal type of experiences that babies are getting from early on in development. LLMs are, of course, just being fed a text. Um,
Yeah.
so that difference also feels kind of important, right? Babies aren't just
Yeah.
hearing the language. They're also getting a ton of correlated perceptual and social information. And their motivation is sort of more directed towards that kind of stuff, right? They're trying to figure out stuff in the world. That's why they are so active. That's why they are so exploratory. They're trying to figure out how to get mom's attention and figure out why that thing, that tower just tumbled over when I pulled out this block, right? That's the kind of stuff that it feels like is like fundamentally different in infant and kid learning versus, you know, your average LLM.
Totally. Yeah. I've been thinking about this a lot in terms of like agency. And we had talked about this a little bit before, but there's this book on agency and cognitive development by Tomasello. And
Right.
he taught, I think there is definitely this, a lot of these LLMs have shown that, you can like definitely get a lot from just learning these statistical patterns. And, people like Jenny Safran, one of your mentors, have shown that like infants are super sensitive to these statistical patterns and can pick up on this information. And like maybe one difference that I've been thinking of is that even though prediction is kind of this active process, there's like infants in specific, or I guess living organisms, they actively do this prediction in support of like this larger agency. So they're they actively sample the world because they have these larger goals that are helping them to be more agentive in the future. I don't know if does that sort of
That
track or
totally
make sense?
tracks. Yeah, and there's like a strong tradition, I think, in cognitive development of developing those ideas. That new book by Michael Tomasello is feels like a really important contribution to that. I also just want to, shout out one of my co-authors, Mariel Gaudu, who now is a philosopher, once a
Yeah,
cognitive
cool.
developmentalist, now a philosopher, and she
Ah,
was a PhD student with Alison Gopnik, another person who I kind of associate very strongly with these ideas that, this um, uh, this becoming an agent process is really formative in infant development, and that drive to exert some kind of causal control over the environment. That's part of the way that infants and young kids express curiosity about the world. Think of the kid. I mentioned the tumbling block already, but think of the games that kids come up with when they're toddlers, right? These are games that are all kind of games about exploring the causality of the environment, right? Like dropping stuff and watching people react, right? Or
yeah,
social games, right? Peekaboo, these games that are kind of about sharing in social experience with their caregivers, with their siblings, right? That seems like to be the stuff that really motivates kids, that kind
yeah,
of causal active control and these social motivations. That's got to be part of the story, right? Um,
yeah,
of
totally.
language learning too. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is one of the things that um, struck me in this book was rereading some of the, because there's this idea that there might be just this pure kind of associative learning that's going on, kind of like the pure empiricist, like, I share a word and then there's some reward for it. And then like, I learn that word because of these associations, or like, someone calls something, something. But the social, like there's all these cool social studies where, a kid, for example, will hear, or they're watching an adult talk, and the adult is trying to label some action, but accidentally does some other one,
Mhm.
and then they they heard that label in association with that accidental action, but they will not learn that pairing because they know, like, because they're involved in these social frames and joint agencies with the communication partners, that wasn't the partner's intention. So they don't learn that pairing. But yeah, I just think that there's so many cool like ways in which kids are really tuned in to, they're really socially motivated and they learn in this like very social way. Um, yeah.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I love those old studies. I think some of that work, those debates about what drives word learning in the first place, what are the right models for these early word learning processes. That's some of the stuff that got me excited about language development in the first place. Um,
Yeah. Well, you have some really
and we
cool
have Michael
studies.
Tomasello to thank for those kinds of studies, and Dara Baldwin is another researcher that I feel like made really formative contributions, showing that using the kinds of studies that you're describing, that infants are really sensitive to what the intention is of um, their conversation partner, and they're very and that shapes how they learn what a word refers to. It's not just a very simple, like, here are the words, whatever I see in view right now, that's the thing I'm going to lock onto and map it to. It's not, well, I mean, I think that happens too, but that's not the only thing that's happening. It seems like infants are really sensitive to what is going on in the conversation, what the intention is, as you beautifully described.
Absolutely. And you have some awesome studies on how kids are, really using a bunch of different strategies to figure out words. Yeah, so there's some on, actively sampling more ambiguous words, for example. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, cool. Um, of course, yeah, happy to. So I think this kind of work came from us trying to think about, so us here is me and Jenny, who you've had on before, trying to think about the ways in which this kind of active interest, active information seeking could be shaping language learning. And the first kind of test cases that we were looking at were all about word learning. And the idea here is that kids are not just, kind of passively absorbing statistics about the world, seeing pictures of the environment and hearing words and then kind of passively associating that stuff. That instead, they're in part because of some of the motivations that we talked about, they're actively trying to figure out, right, what words mean in their environment, because they know, right? They know that those are useful for doing stuff in the world. And so basically we did a bunch of different studies. We've done a bunch of different studies now, basically putting kids in a position where they have kind of incomplete information about what a particular word means or what the label is for some, novel set of characters. And then we put them in the position where they have active control over what they're going to hear or see next. And then we're just curious, what do they do, right? Like, what is the kind of information that they're looking for? So I can kind of ground it in a couple of examples. So we've done a few different ways, but one kind of scenario that we set up is where you're trying to learn about some new alien creatures. These are always, set up to be kind of game-like, fun, engaging studies to kind of make the experiment.
Motivate.
Yeah, exactly. So the cover story here is usually that, they're learning an alien language and there's some new set of alien creatures that they're learning the names for. And then the scenario that we set up is that for some of those alien characters, they then hear the word for that character a number of times. Other ones, they hear more rarely or never. And then after getting that initial training, now we kind of turn it over to the kids. It's their turn to kind of choose what they're going to hear next. And that's kind of the first test, is just, what do they do?
Yeah.
That's what we mean by, different kinds of information seeking strategies. Do they go for the label that they're already kind of familiar with? Do they want to just kind of check and hear that again? Or do they go for hearing the label for characters that they have rarely or never heard the word for? And, it turns out that there's this really nice, beautiful relationship between just the difference in how often they've heard the words for any two alien creatures, that predicts when kids will choose to hear the label for one of them. And this preference is basically to hear the label for characters that they've heard, that they've never heard the word for, or they hear more rarely, right? So they have this strong preference towards more informative choices, informative in the sense that they haven't gotten as much information yet about the labels for those characters.
Yeah.
And you
They're maximizing information gain.
yeah, that's the kind of literature that's embedded in, right? These kind of ideas that infants are trying, or kids in this case, are trying to get as much information about the environment whenever they have chances to control what they're going to learn about next. And you can see how that could be a really useful strategy for word learning, right? Is if you're drawn to hearing words that you are a little bit more unsure about, or that you haven't heard a word for yet, that could really boost how quickly you learn words. It seems like a pretty useful strategy in general for learning a ton of words.
Totally. Yeah. This is so cool. And it like is, kind of a direct, not mark, but yeah, it's like just showing that they're really using active strategies. It's not just this one reason I think this framing is so important is that I think, for a therapist for a long time, when I started, I was thinking in this way that, oh, I'm doing flashcards. I'm going to teach, it's just this like very passive, I'm giving them all the information. They're just going to soak it in. But it's really more of this, dance in a way where kids have their own motivations and they're actively doing things because they want to, maximize their learning, or maybe because they have other interests that we don't know about. But yeah.
Yeah, no, I like, well, it's great to hear that, there's at least some ideas there that feel useful. I should say too that this idea of active learning really has its strongest roots, I want to say, in education, and a longer history there, where people for a long time have sort of recognized that, when teaching, it's really useful to make space at least for students to, um, to have some control over the curriculum and their learning material, and that can often lead to big gains
Mm.
in learning. But I also like what you said about there being a dance, because, you know, I think that's a really nice metaphor for it, because it feels like there is some kind of give and take, right? So I like to think about, like, for me, it's the kid case, right? The kid learning language. I like to think there being this kind of dance between scaffolding from kids' social environment as they're learning language, and that drive to actively learn. There's kind of, and I guess it mirrors a little bit the dance between a student and an educator. Um, uh, uh, so, it seems like that scaffolding, setting up that scaffolding in which the active learning can happen is really important. I imagine, I mean, this is a dumb analogy maybe, but let's try it out. Let's try it out, Garrett. Uh, Active learning can also be tricky, right? If you have no way to kind of constrain how you're going to search the space, right? Like, imagine just
Mhm.
like putting a 5-year-old in contact with all of the internet.
Yes.
It's like too much stuff.
Don't do that.
You don't know how to, I mean, lots of reasons maybe not why not to do
Yeah.
that, but just the vastness of this search space, it's too much information, right? And they don't
Yeah.
have enough structure yet to kind of know how to search and how to find good information, right?
Mm.
But having access to internet or search like tools under some constrained circumstances, that can be super powerful, right? Because then you're using kids' motivations, their curiosities, their interests to, you're kind of leveraging that in their learning, right? So that's at least
Totally.
one way that I think about that dance. I don't know if that's fully what you intended
Yeah.
with that metaphor, but
Oh,
that's
I love that.
one thing I hear.
Yeah. Yeah, that metaphor is so cool. Like I'd not thought about it in terms of constraints before, but it's something, even in my own life, like if I'm making a song, sometimes it's overwhelming,
Mm.
with because there's so many tools now. It feels like you can do a million things. But like sometimes when you add just in that little constraint of like, um, I'm gonna make it in this style, or I'm gonna use these changes or these chords, something emerges out of it. And I feel like maybe in this way, like learning, it needs those constraints. Yeah, or else you haven't. mapped anything or learned anything. So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Well, I hadn't thought about it. No, I think that's a really nice connection. I hadn't thought about it in exactly in this way before, but one of the wonderful things that's happened in the last, 20, 25, 30 years of language development is that we've gotten more and more naturalistic data about how infants are actually experiencing the world from early on. Of course, there's this beautiful tradition in language development that goes up back a long time to try and collect that kind of naturalistic data, but there's been this explosion, right, of a ton of folks doing this really important work to just understand and characterize what those early language environments look like and how much they vary too, right? Across different
Yeah.
kids, across different countries, across different cultures, right? All that stuff is really, I think, changing to some extent how we conceptualize the learning problem. And one of the things that comes out of that work is that um, y- uh, the number of different things that kids are exposed to actually is like kind of more constrained than you might think. So I'll give you two examples. Like if you look at just the distribution of categories that kids experience, chairs and spoons and sippy cups, and that's a super skewed distribution, we call it. It's like a small set of categories are seen very, very frequently, and then a lot of categories are seen very rarely.
It's like Zipfian almost.
Yeah. Yeah, 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 exactly. So it's not this like even uniform training distribution that you might, think coming from the AI world or something where it's like, it's really useful to get like equal training across all categories. No, it's
Yeah.
like, you know, um, very skewed. Um, and, uh, I guess another thing is like, given that we put like, I say we, other awesome, brilliant researchers like my colleague in psychology, Bria Long, who just started uh, at the same time that I did a couple years ago here, put head cams on babies and then just record what they're seeing as they're going about their world, you know, and usually it's just like one or two objects that are in focal view at any given time, at least more than you would think, looking at some of the older language development literature.
Mm.
And that changes the problem in an interesting way. But the connection I wanted to make, sorry for that long setup, but the connection I wanted to make to the constraining point is that actually one way to think about the skew distributions and the fact that actually it turns out that, at any given time, only a few objects are usually in focal view, is that it creates constraints, right? For as kids are confronting this problem, this very difficult problem of trying to map all these sounds they're hearing, or the gestures they're seeing to stuff that's happening in the world. A lot of what they're seeing is routinized as repetitions. There's a lot of, same category stuff seen over and over again,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
at any given time, like there's some constraints over what exactly they're attending to. Um,
Yeah.
at least that's what the naturalistic data seems to be saying. So those kinds of
That's so
constraints,
cool.
like,
Yeah.
might be really important. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh man, this is awesome. That just gave me an idea. Like it sort of feels like, given that infants are active already, they have their own goals. They're seeking, in this way to sort of um, understand their world better, minimize surprise, things like that. Um, our job really as, both caregivers and therapists is we really have a job of constraints. In that, like the one thing that we do as therapists is we suggest language routines, like you're just saying, like having very structured routines that help kids pick up on patterns more easily, or at least it constrains their search space, like you're saying. Um, and yeah, so what like one interesting way of thinking of it as is that I maybe scaffolding is the right way, but also this idea of constraints, like we're providing constraints for like this massive sensory world out there. And we don't want to overwhelm them because there are so many things that they haven't figured out yet that, like, until you get certain things stable enough, you can't move on to the harder stuff. And one thing you mentioned, the internet, like, you wouldn't give the kid the internet, like, all of the data on the internet. It's funny that you say that because like now it sort of is like happening where like kids are having access to these just really, really unpredictable digital environments that are largely unconstrained by like, parents or the platform or the algorithm or whatever. And I think it is causing problems for language learning. I mean, at least in a lot of the literature, there's like these pretty strong associations between amount of device use and communication development and cognitive development more broadly. So yeah, just a thought. That's we are kind of in a way just these like constraining forces on kids that are actively trying to learn the world.
Yeah, yeah. No, yeah, and I'd be super curious to hear about, your experience. I mean, I don't have as much, well, zero really experience on the uh, therapist side of things. So it's also really interesting for me to learn, be here and learn, from you about what are the kinds of challenges that, you encounter now in, trying to help kids who are struggling, right? Um, with language. Yeah, that seems like a really useful dialogue to have.
Yeah, I mean, I'd also be curious to talk with some of the other therapists. I don't know if they have any other thoughts, but like it does seem too like we were talking about agency and action and being active, an active learner. Um, it does feel like sometimes this overuse of devices can be a barrier or some kind of impediment, or kind of
Yeah.
stopping the kid from. It's sort of like hijacking their agency in a way, because things are so salient, bottom up salient, that they just want to keep going back to that. Um, and it's making it harder to actively sample the world in the way that you talk about. Um, yeah, maybe to linger on this active involvement just a little bit longer. Um, in the active learning literature, is it active learning per se that is the reason that it is helpful to, or is it something more about the strategy that helps them choose um, the information that is like maximizing, or whatever's maximizing information? If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, I think it's an active area of investigation across in language and the kind of word learning scenarios that I was sketching, but also in category learning and kids' memory and learning about, I don't know, biological categories and stuff. When is active learning helpful? I think that's maybe the way the question has evolved over time too, away from active learning, always helpful. That might be a naive, like first stance. Or that's like one useful starting point, right? To what are the situations in which active learning might be most useful. And there's kind of reasons to think that active learning could per se could be useful, and some people have argued that. So just having that kind of active control could help sort of boost memory in real time and make sure that your attention is organized towards the right thing because you're the one who's controlling what's about to happen. Um, Maybe there's some like special, like privileged memory encoding process that ends up happening when you're the driver of, what you're about to see in the world. Like the stuff that I choose is the stuff that I remember best is kind of the idea. Um, and there's definitely some evidence for that. Another way to think about it, though, is that, um, uh, you know, uh, well, maybe let me give one more example about that, just because we talked about devices, right? So, imagine a tablet like game where the kid just has to sit there and just watch and absorb what's happening, versus a tablet where, like, they get prompted to engage with the material. Um, uh, that's the kind of active engagement that could be more useful than just this kind of like sitting back and
Yeah,
zoning out and allowing the bottom
yeah,
salience, to
yeah,
hijack your system the way that you put it. I think
yeah.
that, a way people have thought about it. Um, and okay, and then the other idea, and this is the one that we've found some evidence for in some of the work that we were doing, is active learning is especially useful when when it allows you to kind of tune the information that you're about to get to the stuff that
you need the most, that is the most informative for you. So it's not just about having that choice, being able to control what's about to happen. It's about the fact that um, the kinds of choices that we then make are informative ones. So it's useful in the like alien character scenario that I sketched. If we
Yeah.
if we can call back to that, um,
Yeah.
it's kind of useful that kids have this strategy to go and choose that unknown or less familiar character because that promotes more um, unfamiliar words into their vocabulary. So it's not the fact that they have the choice per se, it's the fact that they have a very particular strategy when they have that choice. And that strategy in a lot of these experiments that we've done is driven towards the most informative, the most useful information in this case, unfamiliar words that they now have a chance to learn a little bit better. Hopefully the
Cool.
distinction made sense, but I can elaborate if helpful.
No, yeah, definitely. Yeah, I was almost thinking, so you're talking about that iPad thing or the tablet. I was thinking that active is probably, if we think sort of at that active passive, like kind of a binary, but it's probably a continuum, right? Where it's like, you
I
can
think that's
act on a game. Yeah. But yeah, maybe something more embodied or something like that is,
right,
um,
which is why I think, as you were talking about the kind of device um, point, I think, I mean, I'm not an expert on this topic, but I guess my current stance would be something like, um, devices per se are not necessarily the problem. It's like what you're doing when you're on the device is often the thing I'd worry about
yeah,
the most from a learning perspective. There's definitely lots of useful things you could be doing on
sure.
at communicating through a device. And I feel like that means there's also an opportunity, right? Um, uh, to take it to use, the fact that these devices are becoming more prevalent to figure out how to make them most effective, most useful to kids, most nurturing of their development and learning.
Yeah, absolutely. There hasn't been a ton of like content analysis in the sort of literature, so it'd be important to know. Um, yeah. Well,
Yeah, totally. If people have resources or stuff, I'm always curious to see what people have run into. Yeah.
yeah. Um, I wanted to ask. We had a quick conversation before, and you had mentioned variability, and I just think it's something that's really important to talk about. And you know, I just think you were also talking about this in terms of milestones, right? And a lot of times, milestones for kids, for families, um, for therapists, even that they can be a bit anxiety producing, and that it kind of feels like you need to be here by this time because this is a fixed developmental trajectory, and if you're not here, maybe there's some genetic problem or something like that. But when you start framing it as like, hey, infants are active learners, they're actively learning a skill. There's a lot of variability. There's a lot of ways that, hey, maybe they just haven't been exposed to this word, and you can't say a word if you've never heard it before. So, yeah, maybe just talk a little bit about why maybe this very hard-lined view of milestones might not be exactly appropriate.
When I first started working in a language development lab, so this was with Jenny Safran in Madison when I started my PhD. The fun thing that happens is that, you test an age range. So you set up an experiment, some task where you want to measure some learning mechanism. And then you test within some relatively narrow age range. Let's say I'm going to test 18-month-olds. So that means that I'm inviting families to come into the lab with infants between the ages of 17 and 19 months. So you have this like pretty narrow age band that you're testing, and then you see a lot of kids, right, one after the other across this age range. And I think the thing that this jumps out, or at least jumped out to me when I was doing that, is that man, they're so different at that age, right? On so many different levels, like just motor coordination, but especially when it comes to language, right? Like at 18 months, canonically, right, kids are like mid vocabulary spurt and they're kind of taken off with language. But when you actually are interacting with a lot of uh, infants and toddlers around this age range, right? I'm sure you've seen this too, Garrett, right? They're just hugely variable. Some kids are
Oh
still
yeah.
like just like small words and pretty limited. Other kids sound like they're, are forming full sentences and sound like they're about ready to go into first grade, it's
Right.
crazy the amount of variability that you see once you just see a lot of kids within one age range. And I think that's one reason, I mean, you kind of set this up already, but I think that's one reason or one thing that developmental researchers have come to stress quite a lot in the context of milestones, right? That there's just like huge variation in development of language and development of walking, really in development of any skill that you can name. Um, I just want to shout out Karen Adolph and colleagues who they study walking development for the first for the most part, but they've written very beautifully about um, a lot of the reasons why you know um, uh, milestones are at least not the only way to be thinking about development, and ways in which milestones might kind of set you up to have the wrong assumptions. So in this case, the wrong assumption, right, would be that like at 18 months, I should be seeing kids at this kind of level of language, um, and anything below that is necessarily a sign that something's wrong. Um, of course, sometimes it is a sign that something
Yeah.
could be wrong, and it's super important to try and I don't need to tell this audience this, but that we catch that kind of stuff early. But one of the things that makes it hard, and I'm sure you're very sensitive to this, is that huge variability, right? And a lot of times that variability, is not actually a sign of anything necessarily being off track. It's just individual differences in how this very difficult skill develops over
Yeah.
time. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. It's kind of funny because, we don't freak out if, I was a guitar teacher for a long time. We don't freak out if a kid can't play like, I don't know, 10 chords by age 4 or whatever. But it is a similar thing in that, like, if we're dealing with this like highly complex motor skill that takes time to learn.
Yeah.
Yeah. And kids are super variable, like you're saying. And
But
there's also this variability in interest too. Sorry, go ahead.
no, you were about to switch topics. The thought that I had is that, I mean, it is obviously a very important problem to figure out, like when late talkers, for example, are, distinguished late talkers who are going to bloom eventually and, go on to have a pretty typical language development pathway, and late talkers who might continue to struggle in those later years. That's like
Right.
that feels like one of the most pressing problems. I've been talking about this recently with Mike Frank, who I know you've had on the podcast,
Yeah.
Virginia Marchman. Virginia Marchman, somebody who I really look up to, has done a lot of work to also think about, the clinical implications of some of the kind of in-lab experimental work that we do, and did some really formative work with Anne Fernald on, trying to use these early measures of infant speech processing, language processing, using what's called the looking while listening paradigm. But basically a measure of how quickly infants are processing speech as an extra window into trying to predict, when late talkers might continue to struggle later on. But it's a very difficult problem, right? So, that's definitely a thing that a lot of infant researchers are very concerned about, trying to figure out, right? How can we do a better job of actually diagnosing, or at least getting more information into clinicians' hands about what might be going on in these early stages of language development?
Yeah, totally. Oh man, I'd love to hear more about that. I mean, I hope we have more tools as time goes on. Someone else I've talked to a lot is Nina Kraus, and she has this measure called the FFR, which is like a subcortical, like,
Mm.
is looking at how well you process kind of the lower level features of sounds. which really impact, how you can differentiate speech sounds and so on. But it's just it seems like a great thing to add, because it helps therapists, because we are dealing with, like, I've seen so many kids, and I know everyone in here too has just seen so many kids that they weren't talking by a certain age and they're totally fine. And there's this big, like you're saying, there is such huge variability, and it's so hard to know. Yeah, but at least, with a few more robust measures like FFRs, like, we can really tell you, is there a biological bottleneck? Is hearing impacting, or auditory processing impacting their ability to then process speech, and that those things tend to persist over time if you have a difficulty processing and following speech sounds, or if you're not processing harmonics appropriately, because that's the difference between a da and a ga, or a ba, or something like that. If you're not hearing that, that really can impact a lot.
That's super interesting. I'll have to check that out. Yeah, I mean, it seems like what that really nicely illustrates too is just how complex the series of processing steps that have to happen for infants to be successfully processing language and learning about language. There's so many parts where the process can break down, right? So whatever
Yeah.
to have any hope, you definitely need to triangulate across lots of different methods, it seems like, to probe, um, not just, see that it's breaking down, but also where it might be breaking down in order to figure out
Yeah.
how to best support the learning process.
Yeah. It's kind of the fun job as a clinician too, because you have to get a lot of different evidence. You can't just use, like, okay, they're not saying X number of words by this age, and there is something wrong. So you got to use a few different sources of evidence, and yeah,
Well, super fun to sit down sometime and just like, I feel like this is actually a part of the world that I don't know enough about. So it'd be fun to sit down sometime and just hear about, your sort of process and how you think about which tools are most useful at which point, and how you kind of go about, collecting that information. It feels like there would be a lot of lessons to learn for me there too, about, what actually is useful for figuring out what's going on with a kid.
yeah, I love having these conversations, because it's like, you get the clinical and the research sides, and that's, yeah, something I've been always trying to do, is put those together, because it seems like they exist in two separate worlds too much of the time. So
Totally.
yeah.
Totally. Yeah.
Well, in in kind of part of the ways that hopefully we can uh, increase this, cross learning, is through these open source tools that you've been, spearheading. And I was wondering if you could talk to me a bit about PeakBank, because this seems really cool, and like something that could be really helpful in the future.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and this connects to the stuff I was talking about, the work by Virginia Marchman and Anne Fernald. Um, uh, it's this speech processing task I mentioned is the looking while listening task. So what PeakBank is basically an attempt to build a big database of kids doing this kind of classic language processing task. The task is really easy to explain, sometimes called the visual world paradigm, because what you do is you're trying to measure, does a 12-month-old, does a 14-month-old, does a 16-month-old know the word dog, let's say. How do you measure it? Well, you put up two pictures, say a picture of a dog and a picture of a ball, and then you play them a short sentence like, look at the ball, and then you measure how quickly their eyes move to the correct picture, and how quickly and accurately they're looking at that picture of the dog. That's a measure of their early language processing, whether they know the word, and just how quickly their speech, they're processing speech during that process. So very, very simple technique, but super informative. I think it turns out to be a measure that is super predictive of later development too. We know that thanks to Virginia and thanks to Anne Fernald and other researchers who built up this task. Um, but our idea is basically, um, especially given these huge individual differences, right, in language development that we were talking about, you just need a lot of data to get a high level picture of how language development is progressing. And of course, it's hugely effortful to collect a big data set like that. Like if I was trying to do that and bring in, thousands of babies into my new lab, that would be just a tremendously costly and difficult thing to do. But a lot of different researchers around the world have been using basically the same task. So our idea is basically, hey, what if if we can convince people that it's a good idea to share their data with us, we can do the work of just trying to put it all together in one unified place. So then researchers um, can look at these larger patterns that emerge when you can see data from thousands and thousands of infants doing this kind of simple task across a wide age range, right? So that's what we did in Peak Bank. This is really something that Mike Frank spearheaded, who you've had on the podcast. It's one of these databases. It's only just one of these databases that he's kind of initiated and spearheaded. Another big one is Word Bank, this big, huge now database of the MCDI. This is a parent report measure of its vocabulary. Both are open source, both Peak Bank and Word Bank. So you can literally go to the website right now and you could look at that data. If you're well-versed in R, and that's your jam, there's an API, so you could pull in the data and you could start analyzing it yourself. If that's not so much your jam, there's also some like little apps on the website where you can kind of take a peek at how the data looks and play around with it a little bit, just with point and click kind of interface. But yeah, the idea behind it is, to create that resource that now basically any researcher can go and use. And the way we've been using it is to try and get sort of a better sense of just the longitudinal development in this key skill of recognizing words, and basically to basically support this idea that it is a skill that's actually developing. It has the signatures of skill development, in that there's this kind of predictable pattern between the amount of practice, in this case, what kids' age is and how they're improving in the skill. And it also allows us to ask questions like just how predictive is word recognition ability at a young age for later language development. It turns out that even this simple measure is a pretty good predictor of later vocabulary size and provides some additional information beyond just knowing the kid's vocabulary. So if you know the kid's vocabulary at 14 months, you can make a much better prediction about what their vocabulary might be at 2. But over and above that, if you also know how they did on this kind of word recognition task, you can do an even better job of predicting their vocabulary. And it kind of relates back, to the kind of questions we were talking about, right? Of how can we pull together as many tools as we can about what's going on in a kid's early language processing. One way in which hopefully the data we've compiled is useful is that it kind of shows just how useful that additional piece of information can be in understanding a kid's kind of long-term longitudinal progression in language development.
That's great. Yeah, it feels like something that would be more robust than, when you take a kid in for an evaluation, a lot of times it's like they're in this weird environment, and they not sure what to, do with you. And they sometimes they're just not answering questions or, so even for those older kids, and I imagine that it seems like the tech barriers are getting lower and lower. Like you can have, there's a lot of eye tracking, glasses now that you can wear. It seems like that's something that you could potentially be used for assessment, might be helpful for SLPs.
Excuse me, the NIH Baby Toolbox now includes a looking while listening measure, interestingly.
Cool.
And we've been running this task online. So, we invite it's obviously much easier for families to log in, to something like a Zoom call, and participate in the experiment that way. And turns out we can get pretty good data on infants' word recognition at quite young ages, like at 14 months, just using the webcam from their home computer. So
Oh, so
I
cool.
work with Haley Weaver, who is also a grad student with Jenny, and work with Bria Long and her current lab manager, soon to be Stanford PhD student, Tarun Sipuri, is been doing a lot of work to kind of collect even more data that way, and learn about infants' early word processing.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Again, this has been super fun. Just a couple of final questions. What are you most excited about these days? What do you think needs to be studied?
Well, okay. So one thing, I think you were about to set me up for this, Garrett,
Yeah.
when we were talking about
Sorry.
individual differences. So,
Yes.
one of my grad students, Tori Hennessy, she's got this really cool project going where we're looking at the connection between kids' individual interests. So the way that kids can get like really obsessed about a certain thing, like dinosaurs or leopards
Pokemon.
or Pokemon or, what have you, the way kids can kind of get these focused interests. How does that, then play out in their language development, lead to something like a kind of semantic expertise in that area? Think about all the dinosaur words or all the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Pokemon words that kids then subsequently learn. What can we learn about language development by kind of zeroing in on these focused interests of kids? So she's starting up just some of the first steps there to learn about the language that kids are developing around their focused interests. So that's one thing that I'm super excited about.
That's cool.
Yeah, she just had
What
her
are
first.
what are your thoughts on like what? Sorry, I cut you off.
Oh, no. I was just going to say, we just got back from a conference where the first poster on the project was presented. That was very fun.
That's awesome. Yeah, it seems to me like it would. I'm curious about your thoughts, but a lot of like dinosaur words, Pokemon names, there's a lot of complex speech sounds oftentimes in like multisyllabic words. So I think for like that speech thing, it feels like there'd be a lot of good practice there, potentially. And then like kind of on the flip side, I was thinking that they're not, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but it feels like maybe there's less verbs that are associated specifically with those highly motivating, highly interesting things, which may be limiting in some ways. One thing I've always thought about is like a lot of times, like when if a kid has a AAC device, let's say for example, and they're communicating through their device, sometimes they'll just put like a lot of nouns, Pepsi, Coke, Sprite, and it doesn't allow them, it doesn't give them a lot of communicative power because they have a lot of words that can't combine very easily or, can't express a lot of different things. So if you just know 1,000 dinosaur names, you can only say, sort of like 1,000 things, maybe, probably more, but when you learn other types of verbs, especially that carry like that have room for roles and things like that. I wonder if that.
So
is
it's such
anything
great
that-
ideas. Two things I have not thought about at all. So thank you so much for shooting those ideas my way. I really like the phonological practice idea. That's really cool. So in the experiment, I didn't say anything about the experiment, but in the experiment that Tori is doing, basically it's like, basically we're trying to get kids to produce language, and we have two conditions, one where they're talking about a focused interest and one where they're talking about and something they're not that interested in. That's maybe an interest for some other kid, just not for them. And it could be really interesting to see to the extent to which, there's more complexity in the phonological clusters that kids are producing in that focused interest condition compared to the low interest condition. That could be really like maybe part of what happens as the kids are, engaging with that interest. It would be really interesting if they're just like producing more phonologically complex words. And that actually is really useful to have these areas of interest for just practicing some of the hard stuff, and motivating for practicing the hard stuff. Maybe like, take guitar, like we've been talking about, right? The way like a song that you're really excited about, right? Like you're going to learn that complex solo chord progression that maybe is like very, very difficult to bring yourself to practice when it's just that scale in isolation. But if it's in the context of that song that you really love and you really want to play, that can really help motivate you to kind of put in, go that extra mile to learn it. So
Oh,
that's cool. I
totally.
think that's something we could maybe look at
Tracks.
in that experiment. That's a great idea.
Awesome.
Yeah, loved it. And
Yeah.
the verb idea is great too. Similar idea. Like I don't know yet, but I think we might be able to look at that a little bit. Some of the data we've been collecting. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Well, Martin, thank you so much. It was awesome chat. And thank you for your work. If people want to get involved, can they find you online? Can they follow your stuff?
Yeah. Well, my lab has a lab website, Lil Lab, the Lil
Okay.
Lab.ucsd.edu.
I'll find
Sorry,
it
I said
online.
it's LIL lab.ucsd.edu, lillab.ucsd.edu.
Yeah.
That's my lab. Check us out. Peak Bank, peakbank.stanford.edu. You can check it out, see some of the cool data that we've pulled together there. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot us messages. And check out Many Babies.
Yeah.
Check out the Many Babies website,
Yeah,
manybabies.org. We didn't
Thank
talk
you.
about it at all, but another really fun, super valuable team science effort to just understand more about that variability in infant development that we were talking about.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. I mean, we do technically have a couple minutes. If there's any last minute questions, if people have any, it was, again, so interesting. Any SLPs have any thoughts? Any questions for the professor here?
Still sounds weird to hear.
Congrats on the first exam, by the way.
Yeah, my students just did their first exam in my Growing Minds course, AI babies. They did it.
I would love
out
to
to
take that
them.
course. That sounds really awesome.
It's been a lot of fun to try and figure out how to teach it so far.
Any last
Some Thomas
yes,
fans in the audience?
Elizabeth. Yeah. Why don't we learn about him in school? That's exactly right. I mean,
he could have been easily my origin story. Oh my gosh, Garrett, I didn't do this. Look at the book that I have.
You got it. I
That's
have
the book
it
you were
in front
talking
of
about.
him. Yeah. Amazing.
Yeah, that he could have easily been part of my origin story too. Michael Tomasello, a really inspiring researcher.
Yeah. He has just such an elegant way of really making experiments for a lot of these ideas with kids instead of just kind of hand waving stuff. He's like, no. So,
Yeah. Such fun experiments too. Yeah, you should definitely look up I think some of his talks are online. You can look it up and see some of the tasks that he's developed over time. Super fun stuff.
Yeah. Constructing a language was really a formative read. Anyway, thank you so much. This was awesome. This was so fun. Maybe one day we can do a part 2 because I feel like there's so many more things I want to ask you. But yeah. Thanks everyone.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, and thanks everybody who came and listened. It was so fun to be here. Oh,
thank
show
you
the book again.
Yeah. Show the book again. There it is.
Michael Tomasello, Agency and Cognitive Development.
If anyone wants to reach out, I'm reading that right now.
That's free advertising.
We could do a book
for
club.
You, Mike.
Yeah. Yes. All right, everyone. Take care. Thanks again.
Thanks, Garrett.
Bye.
We'll talk soon. Bye.